Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision. It's like engineering.
Right. Very mechanical.
Exactly. You fall off a bike, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film. And the doctor just points to it with a pen and says, there it is. There's the fracture.
It's a very comforting binary, isn't it? I mean, the bone is either broken or it's not.
Yeah.
The image provides this undeniable visual proof of the problem, which means the solution, like a cast or some screws, is equally straightforward. We crave that kind of categorization in almost every aspect of our lives.
We really do.
Yeah.
But then you step away from the orthopedic ward and into the world of neurodevelopment or intergenerational trauma or, historical legacy.
Right, that changes everything.
Suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless. You're looking for a clean, jagged line, but all you get is this murky, overlapping shadow. The diagnostic landscape shifts from clear-cut engineering to something far more elusive.
Oh, absolutely.
You're trying to diagnose a pain that might not have even started in the patient's own lifetime.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, when you start tracing the etiology of a society's anxieties or the structural disadvantages of a specific community, you aren't looking for a single point of impact.
Right.
You are looking at centuries of compounded systemic choices.
And we are plunging headfirst into those muddy waters today. So, welcome to a brand new deep dive. We've pulled together a massive stack of sources for you today, specifically designed to explore the profound, enduring legacy of imperialism.
So quite a stack.
It really is. And we aren't just going to look at how empires drew arbitrary lines on maps. We're looking at how the architecture of empire imprinted itself on modern legal institutions, on physical bodies, and ultimately on the human psyche itself.
The sources we're drawing from provide an incredible cross-section of this phenomenon, too. We have an independent Home Office research report that meticulously details the historical roots of the UK's Windrush scandal.
Yeah, that report is wild.
It is, and we're pairing that with excerpts from a brilliant analytical book titled Frantz, Fanon, Psychiatry and Politics.
And to sort of bridge the historical bureaucracy with the psychological fallout, we're also pulling from a fascinating academic paper on transgenerational trauma.
Right, the one centering around the novel The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali.
Exactly. And underlying all of this, we have a comprehensive historical overview of the British Empire, just to keep us anchored in the timeline. Because I usually think of history as something safely locked away in the past, right?
Right, like it's just in a textbook somewhere.
Exactly. But today's sources reveal that the architecture of empire is still actively shaping modern borders. It's shaping medical diagnoses and even the subconscious fears inherited by our children.
Yeah, if we really want to understand the modern world we navigate every day, we have to examine how the so-called civilizing mission of empire embedded what scholars refer to as a colonial mentality. That mentality didn't simply evaporate the moment a flag came down and a territory gained its political independence. It persisted, It embedded itself into the bureaucratic machinery, and it mutated.
Because before we can even begin to understand how an empire affects the inner workings of the mind, we have to look at the very physical ways it categorized bodies and how it controlled their movement across the globe.
Yes, the physical movement is key.
The concept of empire can feel very abstract to us now, like a faded world map with sprawling shipping routes. But the reality of border control is gritty, it's physical, and it is deeply inconsistent.
The evolution of that control is vital context here. The British Empire didn't just, manifest overnight as a unified, well-oiled global behemoth. Its origins were actually quite chaotic.
Really chaotic.
Yeah. In the 16th and 17th centuries, under Elizabeth I, expansion was largely driven by privateers like Francis Drake, challenging Spanish and Portuguese dominance.
So basically state-sanctioned piracy.
It was exactly state-sanctioned piracy. Then, the creation of the East India Company in 1600 introduced a corporate element. And that eventually morphed into a massive political and military force, literally ruling millions in India.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when people picture the peak of the British Empire, they aren't usually picturing Elizabethan pirates.
Yeah, they definitely aren't.
They're picturing the 19th century, Queen Victoria, men with enormous sideburns pointing at globes in London drawing rooms.
Right, the so-called imperial century. By the 19th century, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the globe's landmass and population. The famous phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was quite literal.
Right, because the territory spanned every single time zone.
Exactly. But the fascinating contradiction here is how Britain managed its own domestic borders, the actual British Isles, I mean. During this period of unprecedented global expansion, it was anything but a monolithic, highly organized system at home.
Yeah, that was one of the most staggering revelations in the Home Office report for me. You'd think an empire that obsessed over mapping the world would have ironclad borders at home.
You would think so.
Instead, early British borders were essentially either highly porous or completely slammed shut, based entirely on monarchical whims. It wasn't a rigid legal structure at all.
No, not at all.
It was just whoever was wearing the crown deciding what they felt like doing that Tuesday.
The report traces this erratic approach all the way back to 1066. William the Conqueror established what was essentially the first formal immigration control by appointing a constable of Dover.
Right.
But the constable's mandate wasn't about visas or passports. It was strictly about regime security. Keep the monarch's enemies out.
Keep the assassins away.
Exactly. Yet, almost simultaneously, William actively invited Jewish and Flemish immigrants to settle in Britain for their economic and trade expertise.
He treated the border like a faucet. Turn it on for economic stimulation. Turn it off when you're paranoid about your enemies. And that sets a centuries-long precedent of the British border being used as a highly reactive political tool.
A very reactive tool.
And we see this really formalize once the Home Office itself gets established.
Right. The Home Office was created in 1782 in the immediate aftermath of Britain losing the American colonies. They were suddenly dealing with a very volatile geopolitical landscape.
I can imagine.
And shortly after, they had to implement the 1793 Aliens Act. This is widely considered the first piece of modern British immigration legislation, but its purpose was hyper-specific.
It was pure paranoia about the French Revolution, right? I mean, they were terrified that French radicals were going to cross the channel and start setting up guillotines in London.
It was an ideological quarantine. They literally established an aliens office, but if you look at how it operated, it bore little resemblance to modern customs or border control.
What did they do then?
It functioned much more like an early prototype for the intelligence services. They employed code breakers, utilized spies, and tracked individuals in taverns and boarding houses. Anyone who they suspected might be carrying the contagion of revolution to British shores.
Wow. But the moment the threat of Napoleon fades, that entire apparatus just sort of dissolves, doesn't it? The borders become incredibly open and unregulated again for the vast majority of the 19th century.
Yes, the faucet is turned all the way to open, as you said.
But then we hit a massive turning point in the early 20th century.
The 1905 Aliens Act. To understand this legislation, you have to look east. In the 1880s, Tsar Alexander II of Russia was assassinated.
Okay.
His successor implemented the May Laws, which were deeply anti-Semitic and triggered waves of violent state-sponsored pogroms against Jewish communities across the Russian Empire.
Just horrific violence.
Absolutely. Millions of people fled for their lives. While the vast majority boarded ships bound for the Americas, a smaller fraction sought refuge in Britain.
And suddenly, the British government, which had been perfectly content with open borders for decades, goes into a total tailspin.
Of complete panic.
Instead of viewing these people as refugees fleeing violence, they frame the influx entirely through the lens of economic threat and criminality. The 1905 Aliens Act was meticulously designed to target and restrict Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe.
What makes this particularly revealing is that the actual economic data of the time did not support the panic.
Wait, really? It was completely unfounded.
Completely. Studies showed these refugees were not a significant drain on welfare or local resources. The legislation was a purely political reaction, driven by rising nationalist groups and a sensationalist press demanding the protection of British jobs and British character.
It's the weaponization of the border to soothe domestic anxiety. And it forced the Home Office to build a massive bureaucratic machine at the ports just to enforce it.
A machine the Home Office initially resented having to build, by the way. It cost them something like 5% of their total annual budget just to administer the newly appointed alien officers at the docks.
That is a massive chunk of the budget.
It was. But, intentionally or not, the 1905 Act laid the bureaucratic groundwork, the physical infrastructure of exclusion, for everything that would follow in the 20th century.
Which brings us to the core, glaring contradiction at the heart of the British Empire. On one hand, you have these domestic borders tightening up due to xenophobia.
Right.
On the other hand, you have this grand, overarching 19th century legal concept called civis Britannicus sum. I am British citizen.
It was an audacious concept borrowed directly from the old Roman Empire's declaration. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, famously popularized it during a speech in 1850.
And the scope of it was just massive.
Breathtaking in its scope. The theoretical premise was that anyone born anywhere within the vast, sprawling territories of the British Empire was legally a subject of the crown.
Okay.
They possessed an indelible allegiance to the monarch, and in return, they were theoretically entitled to the absolute protection and the fundamental rights of the mother country, regardless of where they stood on the globe.
Wait, if everyone in the empire was technically a British subject, how on earth did they justify treating colonized people so appallingly?
Well, that is the million-dollar question.
It sounds like they built this massive global VIP club, gave everyone a membership card, but the bouncer at the door keeps changing the rules depending on how you look.
That's a great analogy.
I mean, how do you reconcile the grand promise of civis Britannicus sum with the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, or the brutal, bloody suppression of the 1857 Indian Rebellion?
You reconcile it through the deliberate, systemic development of scientific racism. The sources emphasize that the empire absolutely required this racist ideology to function.
They needed it as a tool.
Exactly. Imperialism wasn't a charity mission. It was a vast system built on massive wealth extraction, land appropriation, and resource exploitation.
And you can't exploit an equal.
Precisely the problem they faced. To justify the fact that they were promoting ideas of liberty, parliamentary democracy, and freedom at home, while violently denying those exact same rights to millions abroad, they needed an intellectual loophole.
So they turned to the philosophers.
They did. They relied on prominent thinkers like John Locke and David Hume, who wrote extensively about the supposed natural inferiority of non-white races.
The report specifically highlights a guy named Edward Long. He was a wealthy white plantation owner in Jamaica who wrote a book called The History of Jamaica in 1774.
Yes, a very influential text, unfortunately.
And this wasn't just a fringe pamphlet. It essentially became a foundational textbook for justifying a strict racial hierarchy. He argued that black people were a completely different species, closer to animals than to Europeans.
Which is just appalling.
It is. But it conveniently meant that enslaving them wasn't a violation of their rights as British subjects, because he argued they didn't have any.
It was a brutal categorization of humanity wrapped in the veneer of Enlightenment science. The empire stratified its subjects.
How so?
Well, the white settler colonies, places like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were gradually granted greater political autonomy and self-governance.
Right, they got to rule themselves, mostly.
While territories with predominantly non-white populations in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean were kept under strict, often militarized, repressive control, the supposed universal equality of civis Britannicus sum was nothing more than a legal fiction. It was designed to mask a strictly racialized, extractive, economic hierarchy.
And we see that legal fiction absolutely shatters into pieces with the 1925 Colored Alien Seaman Order. This section of the Home Office report was genuinely staggering to read.
It is a dark chapter.
Consider the context. It is the mid-1920s. You have thousands of black imperial subjects. Men from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from the Indian subcontinent.
Yes.
These are men who had literally just served Britain in the trenches and on the seas during World War I. They had shed blood for the empire. Following the war, they continued working on British merchant ships, eventually making up roughly a third of the entire maritime labor force.
But the post-war boom didn't last. The UK entered a severe economic slump. Shipping contracts dried up, wages fell.
People panicked.
Right. Suddenly, white British workers and the powerful maritime trade unions began aggressively demanding that the shrinking pool of jobs be strictly protected for them. They viewed the black seamen, who were legally their fellow British subjects, as unfair competition.
So how does the government respond to this domestic pressure? The Home Secretary invokes emergency powers to force all quote-unquote colored seamen to register with the local police as aliens.
Right, as aliens.
Unless, and here's the ultimate bureaucratic catch-22, unless they could provide pristine documentary proof of their British nationality.
Proof that the government was acutely aware was nearly impossible for these men to obtain.
Because they just didn't have the paperwork.
Exactly. Birth registration in many colonies was haphazard at best.
Yes.
Plus, many seamen had lost their papers during the chaos of the war or while in transit at sea.
These were men who were legally British subjects who had fought in the Great War under the British flag. They spoke English, they lived in port cities like Cardiff and Liverpool.
Yes.
And overnight, with a stroke of a pen, they were legally classified as aliens in their own empire. They were subjected to constant police surveillance and threatened with deportation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1925 order is not just a minor historical footnote, it is a foundational, structural moment.
It sets the stage for everything.
It does. It is the exact point where the grand theoretical equality of the empire clashed head-on with domestic economic anxiety and deep-seated racial prejudice. And when forced to choose, the British government actively utilized the legal machinery of the state to redefine these workers as outsiders.
Just to protect white domestic interests.
Exactly. It sets a direct, undeniable precedent for the architecture of the modern immigration system.
Because if the empire spent a century telling the world that anyone under the crown was an equal citizen, what happens when those citizens actually try to cash that check and move to the capital?
The system breaks down.
Right. Having established that the state was perfectly willing to shift the definition of Britishness on a whim, we can now see exactly how this bureaucratic shape-shifting led to one of the most notorious political and human rights failures of our time, the Windrush scandal.
The Windrush scandal is a devastating masterclass in how complex, shifting legal architectures can ultimately trap, criminalize, and ruin the lives of the very people they originally claimed to protect.
Let's start with the inciting incident, the arrival of the HMT Empire Windrush, June 1948.
A pivotal moment in history.
The ship drops anchor at Tilbury Docks in Essex, carrying 804 passengers, the vast majority of them from Jamaica. Now, there is a massive, incredibly pervasive historical myth surrounding this specific boat.
A myth that still persists today.
Yes. The popular narrative is that Britain, battered, bruised, and facing severe labor shortages after the devastation of World War II, too lovingly and proactively invited its Caribbean subjects to cross the ocean to help rebuild the mother country. You see this narrative everywhere. Documentaries, textbooks, political speeches.
And the Independent Home Office report we are reviewing systematically and ruthlessly dismantles that myth.
They obliterate it. The British government did not invite them. In fact, when word reached London that the ship had departed Jamaica, the Home Office went into a state of absolute panic.
Total panic.
11 Labour members of Parliament immediately drafted a frantic letter to Prime Minister Clement Attlee. They were pleading with him to deploy the military or use emergency powers to stop the ship from docking. They claimed an influx of colored people would cause massive social discord.
The government was completely caught off guard. When the passengers finally disembarked, they weren't greeted with open arms or brass bands.
Well, definitely not.
They were shuttled away and housed in a temporary subterranean wartime bomb shelter in Clapham South.
Underground.
Yes. The internal government correspondence from this period is incredibly revealing. Officials openly described the arrival of these subjects as an appalling thing with which to be saddled.
Appalling thing. That's how they talked about their own citizens.
They held frantic committee meetings to figure out if there were legal grounds to divert the ship to East Africa instead of letting it reach England.
And the hypocrisy of their panic is what really stands out here. Because to put this in perspective, at the exact same moment, the government was tearing its hair out over 800 Caribbean subjects arriving. The UK Ministry of Labour was running a massive, heavily funded program to recruit 345,000 European voluntary workers.
They were actively scouring displaced persons camps across war-torn Europe. They set up programs with optimistic names like Westward Ho and Balt Signet.
They were recruiting hundreds of thousands of people who did not speak English, who had no connection to British culture or history. They brought over Italian bricklayers to help rebuild the bombed-out cities.
Yes.
And the government was so concerned about their welfare that they literally imported Italian chefs to cook for them so they wouldn't suffer from homesickness.
It's a stark contrast.
But for the Caribbean subjects, who were legally British, who had been raised singing God Save the King, who were educated in the British school system, the government's immediate response was to pressure the shipping companies to drastically raise the price of a passenger ticket, just to deter any more of them from making the journey.
We have to examine the legal context of 1948 to understand why the government felt so trapped, and how they subsequently laid the trap that would catch the Windrush generation decades later.
Right. Let's look at the law.
In 1948, the UK Parliament passed the British Nationality Act. This act created a brand new legal status, Citizen of the United Kingdom and Colonies, commonly abbreviated as CUKC.
And again, the prevailing myth is that Parliament passed this act as a generous gesture to encourage Commonwealth citizens to migrate and fill those post-war labor shortages.
Far from it. It was a panicked legislative response to the Dominion of Canada.
Canada? How so?
Well, in 1947, under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, Canada passed its own Canadian Citizenship Act. They were essentially declaring that Canadians were Canadian citizens first and British subjects second.
Which fundamentally broke the old rules. Until then, whether you were in Toronto or Kingston, Jamaica, you were just a British subject. By creating their own distinct citizenship, Canada proved that the old imperial glue was dissolving.
It terrified Whitehall. The UK realized that if Canada was establishing its own sovereign citizenship, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa would soon follow suit, and the legal unity of the empire would shatter completely.
So the 1948 Act was a band-aid.
Exactly. The 1948 British Nationality Act was a desperate attempt to hold the concept of the Commonwealth together on the international stage. It created CUKC status to cover people born in the UK and in all of its non-independent colonies, and it created a separate, theoretically equal status for citizens of independent Commonwealth countries.
Wait, so under the 1948 Act, the passengers on the Windrush and the tens of thousands who followed them on subsequent ships were completely, 100% within their legal rights to arrive.
Legally, yes, absolutely.
They were CUKC citizens. They held the same legal status as someone born in London. They had the absolute right to live, work, and vote in the UK.
Their arrival was unimpeachable under the very law Parliament had just passed. But the Independent report notes that almost before the ink was dry on the 1948 Act, the UK government realized they had created a massive loophole.
Oh, wow.
They had secured the international prestige of a unified Commonwealth, but at the cost of allowing non-white colonial subjects unrestricted access to the British Isles. And they immediately began trying to figure out how to stop them from exercising that right.
Without looking racist.
Exactly, without violating international diplomatic norms or explicitly stating their racial bias.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean incredibly dark, labyrinthine, and bureaucratic. Because they knew they couldn't just pass a law that overtly said black and brown people are no longer allowed in.
Right. The optics would completely destroy the delicate illusion of the multiracial Commonwealth they were trying to project during the Cold War.
So instead of a direct ban, they spent the next 3 decades constructing a dizzying maze of immigration laws. Each law was specifically designed to severely limit non-white immigration, while employing complex, race-neutral language to maintain plausible deniability.
The first major pillar of this exclusionary architecture was the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act.
What does that do?
This legislation dismantled the unrestricted right of entry for Commonwealth citizens by introducing a complex voucher system. Under the new law, you could only migrate to the UK if you possessed an employment voucher, which meant you either had a specific prearranged job offer or you possessed a specialized skill that the UK government deemed necessary.
Now, on paper, a voucher system sounds like a standard merit-based immigration policy. I mean, every country has them.
On paper, yes. But the internal debates and the practical application revealed its true intent. Politicians at the time openly acknowledged the unspoken reality.
Which was?
White immigrants from old Commonwealth nations like Australia, Canada, or New Zealand would easily secure these vouchers or find ways around the quotas, while non-white immigrants from the Caribbean and South Asia would be placed in categories with severely restricted quotas, effectively choking off their migration.
But the 1962 Act clearly wasn't restrictive enough to soothe the political anxieties of the era, because just 6 years later, they doubled down with the 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act.
The 1968 Act is one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in modern British history. It was rushed through both houses of Parliament in a matter of days.
Why the rush?
The immediate trigger was a crisis in Kenya. Following independence, the Kenyan government under Jomo Kenyatta began pursuing policies of Africanization. They prioritized economic opportunities and government jobs for Black Kenyans and actively pushed out the large community of Kenyan Asians.
Right, many of whom had been brought there generations earlier by the British Empire to build the railways.
Yes. And crucially, when Kenya gained independence, many of these Kenyan Asians had opted to retain their UK-issued passports rather than taking Kenyan citizenship.
So when they were forced out of Kenya, they had the absolute, undeniable legal right to come to Britain. They weren't colonial subjects, they were holding British passports.
To stop the specific influx of Kenyan Asians, the UK government panicked and passed the 1968 Act. The legislation introduced a devastating new legal distinction. It divided CUKC citizens into belonging and non-belonging categories.
Belonging sounds so inherently subjective. How did they legally define who belongs in Britain?
They defined it through ancestry. To be classified as a belonging citizen with the unrestricted right of entry, you had to prove that you, your parents, or your grandparents were born, adopted, or naturalized in the United Kingdom.
So if we look at the mechanics of this, it's essentially a massive grandfather clause.
Exactly what it was.
If you were a white person living in Australia or Canada, the odds that you had a grandparent born in the UK were incredibly high, meaning you retained your right to enter.
Right.
But if you were a Kenyan Asian or a Jamaican whose family had lived in the Caribbean for 300 years, the odds of having a grandparent born on the physical islands of the UK were practically zero.
Exactly. The 1968 Act fundamentally shifted the basis of British citizenship. For centuries, under Civis Britannicus Sum, citizenship was based on itius soli, the right of the soil. If you were born within the empire's territory, you were a subject.
And this changed it.
Yes, the 1968 Act shifted the metric to ius sanguinis, the right of blood. By tying the right of entry to blood ancestry, the government successfully created a proxy for race. They managed to exclude non-white passport holders without ever using the word race in the legislation.
It's an administrative sleight of hand.
Absolutely.
And they tightened the screws even further with the 1971 Immigration Act, which introduced the concept of patrials, again, legally linking the right of abode strictly to UK ancestry. And all of this bureaucratic maneuvering, this decades-long game of cat and mouse, finally culminates in the trap springing completely shut with the 1981 British Nationality Act.
The 1981 BNA is the climax of this exclusionary architecture. It essentially took a wrecking ball to the old imperial structure.
It destroyed it.
It completely abolished the CUKC status that had been created back in 1948. In its place, it established a much narrower, much stricter definition of British citizenship, formally severing the historic link between the UK and the remnants of its colonial empire.
So put yourself in the shoes of someone from the Windrush generation. You arrived in London or Birmingham in the 1950s or 60s as a legal CUKC citizen. You've lived in the UK for 30 years.
Right.
You've worked on the transport networks. You've nursed patients in the newly formed NHS. You've paid taxes. You've bought a house. You've raised a family. And suddenly, the 1981 Act is passed, and the government declares that the legal status you arrived under simply no longer exists.
Now, the legislation did attempt to account for this. The 1981 Act provided a 5-year amnesty window for Commonwealth citizens already residing in the UK to formally register and transition to the new British citizenship status.
Okay, so they had a chance to fix it.
But this is precisely where the systemic intent to exclude collided with catastrophic bureaucratic incompetence.
The communication from the Home Office was beyond abysmal. The report includes a picture of an official government leaflet that was mailed out in 1987, informing people about the changing laws.
Yes, the 1987 leaflet.
And the text of this leaflet is mind-blowing. It explicitly tells people, quote, "If you have the right to register but you do not want to, you do not have to. Your other rights in the United Kingdom will not change in any way." The government literally, in writing, told them not to worry about it.
They were reassured that their status was secure. Furthermore, during those early decades of post-war migration, the Home Office failed entirely to keep accurate long-term records of who had arrived legally.
Because they didn't think they needed to?
Right. Because these individuals were citizens arriving from within the empire, they didn't require visas, so the paperwork was minimal. Later, in a move that would prove disastrous, the Home Office destroyed thousands of original passenger landing cards that could have served as definitive proof of an individual's arrival date.
So let's fast forward a few decades. The UK government decides to crack down on illegal immigration by implementing what they officially called the Hostile Environment Policy.
A very apt name.
The goal was to make life in the UK so administratively difficult for undocumented people that they would voluntarily leave. Suddenly, you have to provide rigorous, ironclad documentation to do anything. To open a bank account, to renew a driver's license, to rent an apartment, or even to receive life-saving cancer treatment on the NHS.
And this is where the trap closes on the Windrush generation. These elderly citizens who had been legally British subjects, who had arrived entirely legally, who had built their lives in the UK, and who had been explicitly told in 1987 not to worry about registering, suddenly find themselves unable to produce the specific paperwork the hostile environment demands.
Because the government destroyed the landing cards. And they never needed a passport to get here in the first place. And the consequences were apocalyptic. Elderly people were fired from jobs they had held for decades. People who traveled back to the Caribbean for a funeral were detained at the airport upon return and deported from the only home they had known for 50 years. People were denied chemotherapy because they couldn't prove they belonged. They were classified, legally and practically, as illegal immigrants in their own country.
It is essential to be very clear about how the independent research report characterizes this catastrophe. The report impartially concludes that the Windrush scandal was not a sudden anomaly, nor was it merely a clerical error. It was the predictable, tragic outcome of a sequence of legislative choices made over several decades. These choices created a systemic environment where minority ethnic citizens were uniquely and profoundly disadvantaged.
It was by design.
It was the compound interest of decades of laws designed to exclude them, colliding with catastrophic record-keeping and misleading government communication.
It is a tragedy born entirely of paperwork, shifting definitions, and institutional paranoia. Which makes me think, if empire was this massive, unfeeling bureaucracy that categorized, excluded, and deported bodies on a macro level, it was equally a system that invaded the mind on a micro level.
Absolutely.
I mean, how did the colonized people internalize this constant systemic rejection? If your government is constantly rewriting the laws to prove you don't belong, what does that do to your psychology?
That is the essential transition we have to make here. When a powerful state apparatus continuously tells a specific group of people that they are inherently inferior, that their bodies are suspect, that their legal status is temporary and precarious, that violence doesn't just stay neatly contained within the pages of a law book.
It bleeds out.
It bleeds out. It enters the psychology of the colonized. It shapes their self-worth, their anxieties, and their behavior.
And this is where we need to bring in our next major source, the work of Frantz Fanon. Now, to truly grasp Fanon's insights, we have to mentally shift our location. We are leaving the corridors of the Home Office in London. We are traveling to North Africa, to a psychiatric hospital ward in the 1950s. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptics. The shelves are lined with dense French medical journals.
It's vital to situate Fanon in this medical context. Today, Frantz Fanon is almost universally remembered primarily as a radical political theorist, philosopher of anti-colonial revolution, the author of fiery texts like The Wretched of the Earth.
Right, that's how everyone knows him.
But to truly understand the depth of his critique, we have to recognize his primary daily profession. He was a trained, practicing clinical psychiatrist.
He wasn't just sitting in a Parisian cafe smoking cigarettes and theorizing about revolution. He was working in the trenches of human suffering.
Very much so.
In 1953, he took up a post as a chief psychiatrist at the Bleda Joinville Hospital in colonial Algeria. And almost immediately upon arriving, he realizes that the traditional psychiatric tools he was taught in medical school in France simply do not work in a colonial setting.
They were completely inadequate.
In his famous 1956 resignation letter to the French Governor General, Robert Lacoste, Fanon writes something incredibly profound. He argues forcefully that it is fundamentally impossible to cure madness in a society whose very structure drives people to despair.
Fanon recognized that psychiatry, as it was practiced and institutionalized in colonial Algeria, was not a healing art. It was weaponized.
Weaponized how?
He fiercely and systematically critiqued the dominant psychiatric paradigm of the region, which was known as the Algiers School of Psychiatry, led by influential figures like Dr. Antoine Perrault. This school of thought had essentially codified racism into medical diagnosis.
Codified racism.
Yes. They claimed in peer-reviewed journals that Algerians were biologically primitive, naturally prone to impulsive violence, and neurologically incapable of higher-order psychological development or complex ethical reasoning.
It's that exact same scientific racism we saw with Edward Long in the 18th century, just dressed up in a white lab coat and holding a clipboard.
It was an ideological justification for empire disguised as pathology. The Algiers school pathologized the entire colonized population. They looked at the poverty, the agitation, the crime rates, and they concluded, look at these people, they are inherently criminal and dependent, therefore they need the strict paternalistic rule of the French colonial state to manage them.
Unbelievable.
Fanon looked at the exact same data and completely inverted the causality. He argued that it is the brutal reality of colonial violence, the systemic dehumanization, the the constant police surveillance, the economic starvation, and the daily stripping of dignity that causes the criminality, the agitation, and the psychological dependency. The colony itself was the pathogen.
I love the specific example the book gave regarding how Fanon dismantled their diagnostic tests. He took aim at the thematic apperception test, the TAT.
Ah, yes, the TAT.
This is a very standard psychological tool where a doctor shows a patient an ambiguous image, maybe a silhouette of a person or a scene in a room, and asks the patient to tell a story about it. The idea is that the patient projects their subconscious fears or desires onto the image.
Price.
The French psychiatrists at Blida were using standard European TAT images, which featured things like Christian cemeteries and European domestic settings, to test Muslim Algerian women who had grown up in rural villages.
Which is just absurd.
When these women couldn't relate to the images or weave complex narratives about them, the doctors concluded they were psychologically deficient. It's like trying to diagnose a software glitch in a Mac using a Windows 95 manual. The diagnostic tools themselves were culturally blind and completely invalid.
What's fascinating here is that Fanon didn't stop at mere critique. He utilized his authority as a chief psychiatrist to act, to completely overhaul the system.
He didn't just write papers about it.
No, he acted. He was a pioneer of what was called sociotherapy, a radical departure from the biological, straitjacket, and electroshock models of psychiatry prevalent at the time. Later in his career, when he moved to Tunis, he helped establish and run a psychiatric day hospital.
The Tunis Day Hospital. The way he ran that facility was genuinely revolutionary.
It was a complete paradigm shift. He flatly refused to refer to the people he treated as patients. He insisted the staff call them guests.
Yes, I love that.
The fundamental driving concept was that individuals suffering from mental illness should not be isolated, institutionalized, and severed from their communities. Under Fanon's model, the guests came to the hospital during the day to engage in group therapy, occupational work, and socialization. But they went home to their families and their familiar environments at night.
He didn't just change the schedule, though. He completely overhauled the power dynamics among the staff.
He had to.
The sources describe how he observed the nurses treating the patients with a sort of aggressive disciplinary control. He realized the nurses were essentially acting like prison guards. There's this amazing, deeply human anecdote in the text about a nurse who was sitting in the ward eating a piece of bread.
Yes.
When Dr. Fanon, the chief medical officer, walked into the room, the nurse immediately tried to hide the bread behind his back, feeling like he was caught slacking off on the job. And Fanon looks at him and says, "Don't hide it. Sit down and share that bread with your patient."
Such a powerful moment.
He wanted to break down the rigid, hierarchical barrier between the sane authority figure and the mad subject.
Fanon instituted those changes because he understood a fundamental truth about colonial institutions. A psychiatric hospital in a colonial setting often just replicated the carceral, punitive dynamics of the colony itself. It was a prison within a prison.
Right.
To have any hope of healing a fractured mind, he had to build a micro-society within the hospital walls. A society based on human dignity, mutual recognition, and shared humanity, entirely separate from the oppressive logic of the world outside.
But if we are talking about Fanon, we have to talk about his views on violence, because this is the area where his legacy gets flattened and misunderstood the most.
It really does.
People who have only skimmed his work often reduce his arguments in The Wretched of the Earth to a simplistic claim that anti-colonial violence is a magical cure for trauma, like a glorious cathartic purge that cleanses the colonized soul. But reading his clinical notes, it's clear that as a psychiatrist, he knew the reality of violence was far more agonizing and corrosive.
He absolutely did. It is true that Fanon argued that colonialism is, at its core, a system of pure, unadulterated violence, and that achieving true liberation often required counter-violence to physically and psychologically shatter the chains of the oppressor.
He called it detoxification, right?
He famously used the term detoxification to describe the process of casting off the colonial mindset through resistance. But he never, ever viewed violence as a clean, consequence-free therapy. He saw it as a desperate, tragic necessity that exacted a terrible toll on the human mind.
The sources detail an incredibly haunting clinical case study from The Wretched of the Earth that illustrates this perfectly. Fanon was treating an Algerian resistance fighter. During the War for Independence, this man had planted a bomb in a cafe that was known to be a popular hangout for notorious violent French racists.
Yeah.
The bomb went off, people died, but years later, after the war is over and independence is won, this same resistance fighter forms genuine friendships with French nationals, people from the former colonizing nation who had come to help rebuild the country.
Right.
And as the annual anniversary of the cafe bombing approaches, the man completely breaks down. He's overcome with crippling bouts of vertigo, chronic insomnia, and intense suicidal ideation. He is terrified and paralyzed by the thought that he might have killed people who were just like his new post-war French friends.
Fanon asks a profound, unsettling question regarding clinical cases like this. Who dares claim that vertigo does not prey on every life?
Wow.
He warned, quite explicitly and tragically, that an entire generation steeped in collective, gratuitous homicide, even if that homicide was deemed politically and morally necessary for liberation, would carry severe somatic and psychic scars for decades. The violence of decolonization deeply dislocates the personality of everyone involved. It fractures the soul.
It's a heavy, heavy price to pay for freedom. And it begs the ultimate question. What happens to that vertigo? What happens to those psychic scars, that insomnia, that fractured personality when the war is over, the treaties are signed, and people try to return to normal life? It doesn't just vanish into thin air.
That perfectly sets up the final piece of our historical puzzle, because Fanon's dire warning about the enduring psychic scars of a generation leads us directly into the modern scientific concept of transgenerational trauma.
Okay, so the trauma moves.
Yes. What happens when those traumatized generations, carrying all that unresolved psychological weight, have children? The trauma doesn't just evaporate, it mutates. It goes underground and it passes down the family tree, finding new ways to express itself.
So what does this all mean on a practical level? How does trauma actually get passed down from a parent to a child? For a long time, we used to think of inherited trauma simply as bad memories. A parent might suffer from PTSD, they might have a breakdown, or accidentally talk about their horrific experiences in front of their kids, and the kids absorb that anxiety behaviorally.
Yes, that was the traditional psychological understanding.
But the academic paper in our sources brings up a startling neurological study that changes everything. Researchers took a group of mice and exposed them to the smell of cherry blossoms. The moment the mice smelled the cherry blossoms, the researchers gave them a mild electric shock. They repeated this until the mice became terrified and exhibited severe stress responses simply by smelling the scent, even without the shock.
It's a textbook example of classical conditioning.
Right. Standard Pavlovian response. But here's where the study goes from standard psychology to mind-bending biology. The researchers then studied the offspring of those shocked mice.
The babies.
The babies. These baby mice had never been shocked in their lives. They'd never even been in the same room as their fathers. Yet the moment the researchers pumped the scent of cherry blossoms into their cages, the baby mice showed an intense, overwhelming fear reaction.
It's incredible.
And this genetic fear of cherry blossoms was passed down through 5 successive generations of mice. The trauma had literally altered their epigenetic markers. The fear of that specific environmental trigger was chemically coded into their biology.
It is a scientific revelation that completely revolutionizes how we understand the long-term impact of historical suffering. In biology, this is explained through DNA methylation.
What is that?
It's the addition of a chemical tag to DNA that turns certain genes on or off based on environmental stress, altering how the brain develops receptors for stress hormones. In the realm of literary and cultural studies, the prominent scholar Marianne Hirsch coined the term post-memory to describe how this phenomenon plays out in human consciousness and culture.
Post-memory.
Yes! Post-memory describes the profound, often overwhelming relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before them.
It's inheriting the trauma of your parents or grandparents so deeply and with such emotional intensity that it feels like it constitutes your own lived memories.
Hirsch originally developed this concept by studying the children of Holocaust survivors. These children grew up in households steeped in the aftermath of unimaginable horror. They were surrounded by the fragmented narratives, the sudden silences, the hoarding of food, the intense anxieties of their parents.
They absorbed it all.
They absorbed this atmosphere to the point where those horrific past events in Europe dominated their own present reality in America or elsewhere, shaping their identities around a trauma they never physically experienced.
But the academic paper we're looking at pushes Hirsch's concept further, explicitly contrasting Eurocentric models of trauma with post-colonial trauma. And the differences are crucial.
This is a vital theoretical distinction. Eurocentric trauma models, which are often based on massive distinct events like the Holocaust or the trenches of World War I, tend to focus on a specific bounded catastrophe.
Right, there's a clear timeline.
There is a clear before, there is the horrific event, and there is a definite after when the camps are liberated or the armistice is signed. Furthermore, these events, while horrific, are often heavily documented with photographic evidence, vast bureaucratic archives, and extensive historical records. The post-generation can look at these archives to historically anchor and process what happened to their ancestors.
But post-colonial trauma doesn't fit that mold at all. It's not a single event. As we established earlier, with the centuries of shifting laws and economic exploitation, colonialism is an ongoing structural reality.
Exactly.
It's a slow violence spanning generations. And crucially, it almost always lacks that objective photographic or archival record. If you are the colonized subject, you don't own the printing presses, you don't write the official history books, and you certainly don't own the cameras.
The colonizer completely controls the mechanisms of representation. They decide what gets recorded and how it is framed.
The paper mentions a deeply unsettling example regarding the comfort women who were brought to the Andaman Islands by the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. These women were subjected to horrific sexual slavery.
Yes.
Yet the only photographic records that exist in the archives are staged, propaganda pictures taken by the Japanese colonizers. These photos show the women smiling, neatly lined up, and looking healthy. The images were deliberately manufactured to make the horrific exploitation look normal, hygienic, and entirely acceptable.
It's horrifying.
If you are the descendant of those women, struggling with the inherited trauma of their abuse, and the only photos that exist in the official archive are glaring lies, how do you pass down the truth of your family's suffering? How do you mourn without the evidence?
When the colonizer controls the archive and weaponizes the camera, the colonized are forced to find alternative indigenous methods of transmitting post-memory and historical truth. And this desperate search for alternative archives is brilliantly explored in the novel The Miraculous True History of Nomi Ali.
Written by Uzma Aslam Khan.
Yes, which serves as the central focus of the academic paper we are reviewing.
The novel is set in the Andaman Islands, a remote archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, which the British Empire turned into a massive, brutal penal colony to exile political prisoners from India. The story follows the children of these exiled prisoners. These kids, characters named I, Nomi, and Z, are absolutely drowning in the post-memory of their parents' trauma.
Because they have no archive to look at.
Exactly. They are surrounded by the silence of exile. But because they don't have family photo albums, and because the only history books available tell the British version of events, they are forced to rely on what the paper calls animistic transference.
Animism, in the context of this novel and post-colonial theory, is the belief that the natural environment, the non-human matter, the flora, the fauna, the weather, is alive, observant, and deeply implicated in human history.
Okay, so the land itself is a witness.
It is the idea that the landscape itself absorbs the blood and the tears of the oppressed.
It's such a beautifully powerful concept to counteract the sterile colonial archive.
Yeah.
The character Nomi doesn't look at a faded photograph to understand the agony of her exiled father. She listens to the island itself. She feels that the howling winds, the shifting water bodies, the very dirt of the Andaman Islands are the true keepers of her family's memory. The trauma of the penal colony literally bleeds into the biomass of the island. There is a moment where the character I learns to identify different winds based on their roles in the colony's history. He feels a specific gust and identifies it as the settler wind, an animistic force blowing through the trees telling the British colonizer, "Leave, you're in my home."
When the conventional structures of making sense of trauma-like courts of law, official history books, or Western medical psychiatry are entirely controlled by the oppressor, the traumatized subject has to derive meaning, validation, and healing from structures larger than human institutions. The landscape itself, the very earth, becomes the only trustworthy archive.
But the colonizers even tried to steal that. They couldn't just take the land, they had to take the physical remains of the people connected to it.
Yes, the theft of remains is a huge part of this.
There is a chilling storyline from the novel that the paper analyzes in depth, which perfectly captures the ultimate, unforgivable theft of memory. The English superintendent of the island's prison, a man named Mr. Howard, forcefully steals the skull of a recently deceased native man.
He doesn't steal it for scientific study or out of any twisted sense of reverence. He steals it simply to sell it for a profit to a Scottish archaeologist who wants to add a savage skull to a private collection of exotic valuables back in Europe.
To Mr. Howard, it's just a morbid trinket, a blasted pile of calcium and bone he can make a quick buck on. But to the native family, the theft of that skull is apocalyptic. The paper details the complex, deeply spiritual native burial rites on the Andaman Islands.
It's crucial to understand these rites.
Right. How they bury their dead in a specific fetal position, how the grieving widow paints herself in clay, and crucially, how they dig up the bones months later to wear them and keep the spirit close to the community.
It is a profound, necessary process of mourning. Wearing the bones is a way of maintaining continuity between the living, the dead, and the ancestral land. It closes the circle of life and death.
By stealing the skull and shipping it off to Europe, Mr. Howard isn't just stealing an artifact, he is metaphysically preventing the soul of the dead man from resting. And worse, he is trapping the living family in a state of perpetual, unresolved grief.
Yes, they are stuck.
They cannot process the trauma of the death, they cannot complete the rituals of mourning, because the physical tether to their past has been violently ripped away and locked in a crate.
And what makes this literary analysis so deeply impactful is that Uzma Aslam Khan is not just writing historical fiction, she is reflecting a very dark, very real, and systemic historical practice.
It happened everywhere.
The academic paper explicitly connects Mr. Howard's fictional theft to real-world examples of colonial empires looting the sacred artifacts and human remains of colonized peoples across the globe.
It mentions the Pitt Rivers Museum in the UK, which currently holds thousands of Nigerian brass objects that were looted by the British Navy during a punitive expedition in 1897.
The Benin bronzes.
Yes. The local Edo word for those specific brass objects literally translates to remember. They were cast specifically to serve as historical records for the kingdom. By taking them, the British literally stole their memory. They stole their archive.
Or consider the actions of the French state. The paper notes that until the year 2020, just a few short years ago, the French government held the skulls of 24 Algerian resistance fighters who were killed opposing the initial French invasion in the 1840s.
Until 2020.
Yes. For over a century and a half, these human remains were kept in a museum in Paris.
Kept as morbid trophies of the civilizing mission, it is grotesque.
Scholars like the archaeologist Dan Hicks refer to these stolen artifacts and human remains as necrographies.
Necrographies.
Yes. They are not just collections of old things, they are deliberate, aggressive attempts by empires to rob colonized people of their past. By removing these deeply significant items from their cultural, spiritual, and animistic context and locking them in European glass cases, the colonizer actively halts the healing process of post-memory. They freeze the colonized culture in a permanent state of loss and longing.
It's a way of ensuring the trauma can never truly be resolved. The generational connection is deliberately severed. The bones that should be worn to bring peace are sitting under fluorescent lights thousands of miles away.
Precisely. And until those items are unconditionally returned, until the necrography is acknowledged and reversed, the descendants of the colonized remain trapped in what one official painfully called a post-mortem exile. They are exiled from their own history.
Which brings us all the way back to the present moment, to you listening to this deep dive right now. Look at the incredible journey we've taken today. We started by looking at the massive, unfeeling bureaucracy of the British Empire. Kings and parliaments turning the taps of migration on and off, passing the 1905 Aliens Act to exclude refugees.
Yes.
And inventing grand fictions like Civis Britannicus Sum, while actively deciding who gets to be a citizen based entirely on the color of their skin and the needs of domestic trade unions.
We saw how that imperial architecture evolved into the legal mazes of the Home Office. We saw how the 1968 introduction of belonging citizens, based on a grandfather clause, systematically trapped the Windrush generation in a web of shifting definitions, missing paperwork, and a hostile environment that criminalized them in the only home they had ever known.
We traveled to a psychiatric hospital ward in North Africa, where Frantz Fanon refused to accept that colonized people were biologically primitive, and instead fought to decolonize the minds of patients driven to madness by the sheer crushing weight of systemic oppression and structural violence.
And we ended in the intricate realm of biology and memory, looking at the genetic ghosts of trauma passed down through the scent of cherry blossoms, through the animistic winds of an island penal colony, and through the stolen skulls and artifacts locked in our museums.
We did this because The world we live in, the passports we hold in our pockets, the political borders we argue over on the news, and perhaps even the deep-seated, inexplicable anxieties we feel in our own bodies. They are not entirely our own. They are the echoes of a history that absolutely refuses to stay safely locked away in the past.
We spend so much time in our modern society debating how to write history books, or arguing over what curriculum to teach in schools, as if history is just a collection of dates to be memorized.
Right.
But if trauma is passed down through the methylation of our DNA, if the memory of suffering is held by the very landscape we walk on, and if our cultural heritage is sitting in a glass case thousands of miles away, then history isn't just something we read, it is something we deeply, physically embody.
So here is a thought to take with you, something to mull over long after this deep dive ends. The next time you walk through a grand marble museum in a major Western capital, and you look at a culturally displaced artifact, a brass casting or a sacred carving sitting quietly behind a pane of temperature-controlled glass, ask yourself, whose memory is trapped in that room? And what happens to the descendants who are still waiting generations later for that memory to finally come home?
Because until we understand the depth of that lingering absence, we're just looking at symptoms.
We are looking at that diagnostic X-ray of our modern world, hoping for a clean, binary answer. But the image is murky. It is shadowed by these ghosts, by these bureaucratic borders and psychic scars. And the only way to heal the break is to finally read the X-ray for what it really is. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us.